Bleeding, desperate, and completely out of time, she offered a dangerous deal to the most feared Alpha King. Her ruthless ex was closing in to claim her soul as she shivered on the cold stone and begged, "Marry me for one day." Wiping the blood from her cheek, he smirked. Forever sounds better. The northern forests of Ethelgard were unforgiving on a good day, but tonight they were a death trap. Evangeline ran until the taste of copper flooded her mouth and her lungs screamed for mercy. The freezing rain lashed against her skin, turning the muddy forest floor into a treacherous slide, but she didn't dare slow down. Behind her, echoing through the ancient pines, was the sound she dreaded most: the hunting horns of the Ironjaw clan. Leoric was coming for her. Evangeline, the last surviving daughter of the ruined Riverbend pack, had been sold. Her father, Lord Reginald, a man broken by war and debt, had signed her away on a piece of parchment as if she were nothing more than a sack of winter wheat. Leoric was the alpha of the Ironjaw clan, a man whose hands were permanently stained with the blood of his enemies and his former mates. 2 women had preceded Evangeline in Leoric's bed, and both had met tragic, sudden accidents before their first winter was over. Leoric didn't want a mate. He wanted a punching bag, a trophy, and the ancient, latent magic that ran in the Riverbend bloodline. For 3 years, she had played the obedient fiancé, smiling through the bruises, whispering hollow promises, while secretly mapping every exit out of the Ironjaw fortress. Tonight, on the eve of the blood-binding ceremony that would tie her soul to his for eternity, she had slipped poison into the guard's ale and bolted. But Leoric was a tracker. He would not let his prize escape so easily. Lightning fractured the sky, illuminating the jagged peaks in the distance. There, sitting atop a cliff of black obsidian, was Winterbourne Castle. It was the ancestral seat of Dominic Ashdown, the Alpha King of the North. Dominic was a legend whispered about to frighten disobedient pups. He was a beast of war, a sovereign who had united the northern clans through sheer, terrifying brutality. He hated the Ironjaw clan. Leoric had once attempted to annex a border village belonging to Dominic, an error that cost Leoric half his army and left him with a permanent jagged scar across his throat. The enemy of my enemy, Evangeline thought, her soaked cloak clinging to her trembling frame. By the time she reached the colossal iron gates of Winterbourne, she was barely conscious. Her velvet dress was torn to shreds, her bare feet bleeding from the rocks. 2 towering guards, shifting nervously under the stormy sky, crossed their halberds as she collapsed against the cold metal. "State your business, stray," one of the guards barked, his amber eyes glowing in the dark. I am Evangeline of Riverbend," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper against the howling wind. "I demand sanctuary. I have an offer for the Alpha King." The guards laughed, a harsh, guttural sound. "The king does not take visitors in the dead of night, let alone runaway Omegas." "Tell him," Evangeline commanded, summoning the last ounce of her aristocratic pride, "that I can give him the legal right to slaughter Leoric of the Ironjaw. Tell him that, and he will open these gates." 10 minutes later, Evangeline was being dragged by her arms through the echoing, cavernous halls of Winterbourne. The air inside was heavy with the scent of wood smoke, roasted meat, and the overwhelming, suffocating aura of a true alpha. She was tossed onto the center of a sprawling crimson rug in the great hall. She pushed herself up on her hands and knees, water dripping from her matted hair onto the ancient stone. "A river bend pup," a voice rumbled. It didn't echo. It seemed to vibrate directly inside her chest. Evangeline looked up. Dominic Ashdown sat in a high-backed chair, carved from dark oak and wolf bone. He was devastatingly imposing, dressed in simple dark leathers that did nothing to hide the heavy muscle of his chest and arms. He leaned forward, resting his chin on a massive fist. His hair was jet black, falling past his shoulders, but it was his eyes that stole the breath from her lungs. They were a piercing, luminescent silver, calculating and cold. A faint silver scar cut through his left eyebrow, trailing down to his sharp jawline. "My guards tell me you hold the key to Leoric's head," Dominic said, his voice a low drawl that betrayed no emotion. "A bold claim for a woman who looks like she just crawled out of a swamp. Speak, little wolf, before I lose my patience and throw you back to the storm." Evangeline forced herself to stand. Her knees buckled, but she locked them in place, refusing to show weakness before the apex predator of the north. "Leoric is hunting me," Evangeline said, her voice steadying. "We were to be bound at dawn. If I am caught, he will claim me. But by the ancient laws of Ethelgard, a binding ceremony cannot proceed if the Omega is already claimed by an Alpha of higher rank." Dominic's silver eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't move an inch, but the air in the room suddenly grew heavier, pressing down on her shoulders. And, Evangeline swallowed hard, stepping forward. "I have inherited the deeds to the whispering valleys of Riverbend, the only pass through the eastern mountains. Leoric wants it to expand his army. If you help me, I will sign the deeds over to you." Dominic let out a low, dark chuckle that sent a shiver straight down her spine. "I have a massive army, Evangeline of Riverbend. If I want the eastern valleys, I will simply march down and take them. Why would I entangle myself in a desperate girl's domestic disputes?" Desperation clawed at her throat. She could hear the faint, distant baying of hounds outside the castle walls. Leoric was at the gates. Her time was up. She closed the distance between them, ignoring the warning growls of the guards lining the hall. She stopped right at the base of his dais, looking up into his lethal, beautiful face. "Because," she whispered, her voice cracking with raw emotion, "if he binds me, he gains access to the Riverbend magic. He will use it to poison your lands, Dominic. You know what he is. Please." She fell to her knees, looking up at him. "Marry me. Just for one day. A temporary binding of blood. It will nullify Leoric's claim entirely. Tomorrow, we annul the union. You get the valleys, and I get my freedom." For a long, agonizing moment, the great hall was dead silent. The crackle of the hearth fire was the only sound. Dominic stood slowly. He was a towering figure, casting a massive shadow that completely enveloped her. He walked down the steps of the dais, his boots silent on the stone, until he was standing inches from her kneeling form. He reached down, his large, calloused hand gripping her chin. He tilted her face up, forcing her to meet his silver gaze. His thumb gently brushed a streak of mud and blood from her cheek. A strange electric shock jolted through Evangeline's veins at his touch. Her wolf, which had been cowering in terror for 3 years under Leoric's shadow, suddenly perked up, whining and pacing in her mind. Dominic stared at her lips, then up to her eyes. A slow, wicked smirk spread across his face, transforming him from a cold king into something dangerously alluring. "Marry you for one day," he repeated, the words tasting different on his tongue. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear, sending a flurry of heat down her neck. "A terrible deal, little wolf. I think forever sounds better." Evangeline froze, her mind short-circuiting. Forever? Before she could process the weight of his words, the heavy oak doors of the great hall shuddered violently. A deafening crash echoed through the chamber as the iron bolt groaned under immense pressure. "My king!" a scout yelled, running into the hall from a side corridor, out of breath. "The Iron Jaw forces are breaching the outer courtyard. Lord Leoric is demanding the return of his stolen property under the Treaty of the Blood Moon." Dominic didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the scout. His silver eyes remained locked on Evangeline, who was trembling violently. The Treaty of the Blood Moon meant Leoric had legal grounds to wage war if another alpha harbored his betrothed. "Stolen property," Dominic mused, his thumb tracing the line of Evangeline's jaw. "Is that what you are?" "I am no one's property," she hissed, a spark of defiance igniting in her chest despite the terror. Dominic smiled, a real, terrifyingly bright smile that showed a hint of his elongated canines. "Good." He turned to the shadows in the corner of the room. "Lady Beatrice," an older woman cloaked in heavy grey robes, stepped forward. She was the High Priestess of Winterborn, her eyes entirely white and blind, yet she moved with absolute certainty. "Prepare the blood rite," Dominic commanded, his voice suddenly shifting into the booming, authoritative roar of an alpha king. "Right here, right now." "Dominic, wait!" Evangeline panicked, grabbing his leather sleeve. "What do you mean, forever? I asked for a temporary sanctuary. An annulment." "There are no temporary bindings in Winterborn," Dominic interrupted, his voice dropping an octave as he turned back to her, backing her up against the steps of the dais. "You came into my territory. You offered yourself to me to spite your enemy. I accept your terms, Evangeline. But I do not play house, and I do not borrow what I intend to keep." "You don't even know me," she cried, as the great oak doors shuddered again, the wood beginning to splinter. "I know your scent," he whispered fiercely, leaning in so close she could smell the dark pine and impending storm on him. "I knew it the second you crossed my borders. You think this is a coincidence? That of all the castles in Ethelgard, your feet dragged you to mine?" Evangeline's eyes widened as the realization hit her. The electric shock, the sudden awakening of her inner wolf. It couldn't be. True mates were a myth, a bedtime story told to pups to make them believe in destiny instead of politics. "Bring the chalice," Lady Beatrice chanted, stepping between them holding a silver goblet and a wicked-looking obsidian dagger. Crash! The great doors burst open. Splinters of ancient oak rained across the stone floor. Standing in the threshold, drenched in rain and flanked by heavily armed, snarling warriors, was Leoric. He was a tall, wiry man with cruel, sunken eyes and the ugly, jagged scar across his throat that Dominic had given him years ago. His gaze swept the room, entirely bypassing the heavily armed Winterborn guards, until it locked onto Evangeline. A sickening, possessive grin twisted Leoric's face. "There you are, my sweet, slippery little bride," Leoric purred, drawing a long, serrated sword from his hip. He stepped into the hall, ignoring diplomatic protocol. You've caused me a great deal of trouble tonight, Gen. But we can handle your punishment at home. Come here. Evangeline took a step back, her heart hammering against her ribs. Lord Leoric! Dominic's voice cut through the tension like a physical blade. He stepped in front of Evangeline, completely shielding her from Leoric's view. You are trespassing in my halls. Sheathe your weapon, or I will take your other hand to match the throat I ruined. Leoric sneered, though he stopped his advance. Dominic Ashdown. I should have known the stench of this place would attract a stray. I am well within my rights. The Blood Moon Treaty states you cannot harbor a runaway betrothed. Hand her over, King, or I will declare war on the North. You cannot declare war over a betrothed, Dominic said smoothly, casually rolling up the sleeves of his leather tunic to reveal arms corded with scars and muscle. She is mine, Leoric snarled, taking another step. She was yours, Dominic corrected. He reached back without looking and grabbed Evangeline's wrist, pulling her firmly to his side. Before Leoric could react, Dominic took the obsidian dagger from Lady Beatrice. In one fluid motion, he sliced the palm of his own hand, then grabbed Evangeline's hand and sliced hers. She gasped at the sharp pain, but Dominic's grip was like iron. He pressed their bleeding palms together over the silver chalice. Leoric's eyes went wide with rage. "Stop them!" he roared to his men. The Iron-Jaw warriors surged forward, but the Winterborn guards instantly dropped their halberds, forming an impenetrable wall of steel and muscle between the door and the dais. The metallic screech of weapons being drawn filled the room. "By the blood of the earth and the light of the moon," Lady Beatrice chanted rapidly, throwing a handful of crushed herbs into the hearth fire. The flames erupted, turning a brilliant, blinding blue. Two souls bound, two packs merged. No man can sever what the goddess claims. "Evangeline!" Leoric screamed, his voice cracking with a mixture of fury and panic as he tried to push through the guards. "If you do this, I will burn Riverbend to the ground. I will slaughter everyone you ever loved." Evangeline looked at Leoric, the man who had tortured her, who had kept her in a cage of fear. Then she looked up at Dominic. The Alpha King's silver eyes were blazing as he stared down at their joined, bleeding hands. "Say the words, Evangeline," Dominic commanded softly, intimately, meant only for her ears despite the chaos around them. "Bind yourself to me, and he will never touch you again." She didn't hesitate. She looked Leoric dead in the eye over the shoulders of the guards. "I bind my soul to Winterborn," she said, her voice ringing clear and steady through the cavernous hall. Dominic's smirk returned. He lifted their joined hands to his mouth, kissing the spot where their blood mixed. As his lips touched her skin, a searing, white-hot energy exploded through Evangeline's body. It wasn't a political treaty. It was a mating bond clicking into place, so profound and powerful it brought her to her knees. Leoric stood frozen in the doorway, his face pale, realizing he had just lost his prize to the most dangerous man in the kingdom. Dominic looked over Evangeline's head at his rival. "The lady is now the Queen of the North, Leoric. If you so much as breathe in her direction again, I won't just ruin your throat. I will erase your entire bloodline from history." The tension in the room snapped tight, like a wire ready to break, as Leoric raised his sword. The blue flames in the hearth slowly faded back to a crackling orange, leaving the great hall thick with the heavy scent of ozone, cedar, and raw, untamed magic. Evangeline remained on her knees for a second, her chest heaving as the residual shock of the blood binding hummed through every nerve ending in her body. The bond wasn't just a legal contract. It felt like a second heartbeat, thumping rhythmically beneath her own, anchoring her to the towering man standing beside her. Leoric's face morphed from absolute fury into a mask of calculated malice. He lowered his sword an inch, his eyes darting between Dominic and Evangeline with undisguised hatred. "A forced union," Leoric spat, his voice dripping with venom as he spat onto the stone floor of the hall. "You think a hasty ritual in the middle of the night makes you safe, little bird? The High Council will never recognize a mating forged under duress and political extortion. I will petition the elders at the next solstice. Enjoy your night as queen, Dominic. Her blood is still legally tied to my house's debts." Dominic didn't draw a weapon. He didn't even raise his voice. Instead, he stepped down from the dais, his presence so overwhelmingly suffocating that Leoric's front-line guards instinctively took half a step backward. "Petition the elders all you like, Leoric," Dominic murmured, closing the distance until only a few feet separated them. "And while you're waiting for the solstice, I suggest you check the eastern borders. Rumor has it that your treasury has been heavily mismanaged. It would be a tragedy if someone seized your assets to pay off Riverbend's back taxes which, as you know, now legally belong to my royal house." Leoric's color drained instantly. The debts he had used to trap Evangeline's father had just become a weapon in the hands of the Alpha King. "You wouldn't," Leoric whispered. "Try me," Dominic replied, his silver eyes flashing with a predatory gleam. "Get out of my fortress before I forget I am a king, and remember I am a beast." For a tense moment, it looked as though Leoric might throw all caution to the wind and charge, but the sheer, crushing weight of Dominic's alpha aura broke his resolve. With a guttural snarl of pure frustration, Leoric turned on his heel, shoving past his men. "Fall back," he ordered. Within minutes, the sound of the Ironjaw clan retreating into the stormy night faded into the howling wind. Silence settled over the great hall, broken only by the crackle of the fire and Evangeline's ragged breathing. Dominic turned around, walking slowly back up the stone steps. He looked down at Evangeline, who was still kneeling, her palms stinging where the obsidian blade had sliced them. Without a word, he reached down, scooped her effortlessly into his arms, and strode out of the hall before any of the servants or guards could utter a single syllable. "Put me down," Evangeline whispered weakly. Though she lacked the strength to fight him, the adrenaline crash was hitting her hard, leaving her limbs feeling like lead. "I can walk." "Quiet, little wolf," Dominic rumbled against her hair as he carried her up the spiraling stone staircase of the eastern tower. "You've done enough running for one lifetime." He carried her past ancient tapestries depicting northern conquests and massive iron sconces straight into the royal chambers. The room was vast, dominated by a massive hearth and a fur-strewn bed that looked large enough to swallow a family. The air here was warm, scented with pine needles and heavy winter honey. Dominic gently set her down on the edge of the mattress. He walked over to a carved wooden wash basin, dampening a soft cloth with warm water. When he returned, he knelt before her, gently taking her blood-stained hand in his large, calloused grip. Evangeline flinched slightly as the warm cloth touched her skin, washing away the dried blood. She looked down at his dark head, noticing the way the firelight caught the sharp angles of his profile. "Why?" she asked softly, breaking the thick silence. You didn't have to bind your soul to mine, Dominic. You could have just killed Leoric, taken the valley deeds, and thrown me out into the storm. Dominic paused, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. He looked up, his luminescent silver eyes locking onto hers with a startling intensity that made her breath hitch. Do you really think a king hands out his name and his blood to every stray that wanders onto his doorstep? Dominic asked, his voice low and serious. I told you the truth in the hall. When you crossed my borders, the air changed. My wolf has been restless for 5 years, ever since the northern curses started fracturing our packs. He knew you were coming before you even reached the gate. A true mate bond, Evangeline breathed, shaking her head in disbelief. It sounds like a fairy tale, designed to trap women. It's no fairy tale, Dominic said, standing up to tower over her. He reached out, his fingers lightly brushing a lock of damp brown hair away from her cheek. A shiver rippled down her spine at the contact. It's a cage, Evangeline, just a much nicer one than the one Leoric built for you. But unlike Leoric, I intend to let you keep your wings. And tomorrow? She asked, her voice laced with lingering fear of betrayal. When the council demands answers, when Leoric sends assassins. Tomorrow, Dominic smirked, his dangerous charm returning in full force. We show the council what happens when you anger the king of the north. But tonight you are safe. He turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors, pausing with his hand on the iron latch. Get some sleep, Evangeline. My guards are stationed outside. No one touches you in Winterbourne. The door clicked shut, leaving her alone in the massive, warm room. Evangeline stared at the fire, her mind spinning, realizing that while she had escaped one monster, she had willingly walked into the den of an even greater one. But for the first time in 3 years, she closed her eyes without fear. The great council chambers of Ethelgard were carved directly into the living rock beneath the mountain. A sprawling amphitheater where the elders of the northern clans gathered to judge kings and settle disputes. The air was frigid, smelling of old parchment, damp stone, and the collective disapproval of a dozen conservative lords. At the center of the obsidian floor stood Evangeline, dressed not in the torn, muddy rags of a fugitive, but in a sweeping gown of midnight blue velvet, embroidered with the silver wolf crest of Winterbourne. Beside her stood Dominic, his hands clasped behind his back, looking utterly bored by the proceedings. High Elder Robert, an ancient wolf whose grey hair fell past his shoulders and whose eyes were clouded with age, leaned heavily on his gnarled wooden staff. King Dominic, Robert's voice echoed off the stone walls. We received the emergency petition from Lord Leoric of the Ironjaw clan. He claims you unlawfully performed a blood-binding ritual on a woman legally betrothed to his house under the sacred Blood Moon Treaty. How do you plead against the charge of domestic piracy? A murmur rippled through the gathered lords and ladies in the stone-tiered seating. Whispers of tyranny, abuse of power, and illegitimate union floated down from the shadows. Dominic didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his boots clicking sharply against the floor. Domestic piracy, Elder Robert? Dominic's voice cut through the murmurs like a knife. That is a fascinating accusation coming from a man who hasn't audited the Ironjaw financial ledgers in a decade. Leoric, sitting in the prosecution's seat across the room, stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. This tribunal is about a stolen bride, not my ledgers, Dominic. The girl belongs to me by contract. Her father signed away her rights before witnesses. He signed away her rights under duress, while his lands were illegally occupied by Ironjaw mercenaries. Evangeline spoke up, her voice ringing clear and steady across the chamber. She stepped forward, lifting her chin with aristocratic poise. She pulled a folded parchment from the sleeve of her gown and held it up. Furthermore, the contract was contingent upon Leoric paying the seasonal maintenance tariffs for Riverbend, tariffs he defaulted on for 36 consecutive months, rendering the agreement null and void under ancient northern law. Leoric's jaw dropped. That document was locked in my private safe. How did you... When you spent your nights drinking ale and plotting how to bleed my family dry, Leoric, you always left your study door unlocked, Evangeline said, with a cold, triumphant smile. Dominic looked sideways at his new queen, a flicker of genuine amusement and pride dancing in his silver eyes. He turned back to the High Council, holding up a heavy leather pouch that he tossed carelessly onto the central stone table. And as for the blood binding, Dominic continued smoothly, let us not forget that a true mate bond supersedes any financial or political contract in the eyes of the goddess. Lady Evangeline crossed my borders dying, hunted by a man who had already murdered 2 previous fiancées under mysterious circumstances. The council erupted into chaos. Shouts and growls echoed from the tiers as the elders whispered among themselves. The dark history of Leoric's past fiancées was an open secret everyone had ignored, until now. Elder Robert struck his staff against the stone 3 times, restoring order. He squinted toward Dominic and Evangeline, his old eyes trying to read the invisible threads of magic humming between them. Is the bond genuine, King Dominic? Robert asked sternly. Do you claim her before the gods, not just as a political shield, but as your true queen? Dominic stepped closer to Evangeline. Without hesitation, he reached out, taking her hand and intertwining his fingers with hers. He looked down into her eyes, and beneath the gaze of the entire Northern Council, his expression softened into something intensely real. She is my soul, Elder, Dominic said, his voice carrying the full, resonant power of an Alpha King. Try to tear her away from me, and you will see what true war looks like. Evangeline felt a warm rush flood through her chest as the mating bond flared in response to his words. She looked up at him, realizing with a sudden, breathless jolt that the dangerous deal she had struck to escape her nightmare had accidentally given her a kingdom, and a king who would burn the world to ashes before letting her go. Elder Robert stared at them for a long, agonizing moment before letting out a slow breath. He raised his staff. The blood binding is recognized, Robert declared. The petition of the Ironjaw clan is dismissed due to breach of contract and default of tariffs. Long live the King and Queen of the North. As the chamber erupted into cheers and reluctant bows from the rival lords, Leoric stormed out of the hall, his face twisted in absolute defeat. Dominic pulled Evangeline closer against his side, leaning down so his lips brushed her ear. Well, little wolf, he smirked, the dangerous edge returning to his voice. We survived day 1. Only eternity left to go. Evangeline smiled, resting her head against his solid, powerful shoulder. Forever sounds like just enough time. Did Evangeline make the right choice trading a tyrant for the fearsome Alpha King, or did she finally find her true destiny? Their eternal reign is just beginning. If this medieval werewolf romance had your heart racing, don't leave us howling at the moon alone. Hit that like button, share this video with fellow romance addicts, and subscribe for more epic fantasy stories. What would you have done in her shoes? Drop a comment below.